Most men will read this, nod slowly, and change absolutely nothing. That is not an insult. That is a diagnosis. And before you decide whether you are the patient or the physician in this room, you must first understand what separates the man who builds empires from the man who merely dreams of them, and that distance, that terrifying silent distance, is not talent, not circumstance, not the accident of birth or the blessing of fortune. It is something older than all of those things. It is something so simple that its simplicity becomes its greatest disguise. It is discipline over mood. And if you have never considered that phrase with the full weight it deserves, then sit still, because what follows will either disturb you or transform you, and there is no comfortable middle ground between those two destinations. Let us begin with a truth that no one enjoys hearing. The majority of human beings on this earth do not live by decisions. They live by feelings. They rise when they feel like rising. They work when the conditions feel favorable. They pursue their ambitions on the days when ambition feels warm and close and possible, and they abandon their ambitions on the days when it feels cold and distant and foolish. They are, in the most precise use of the term, mood-governed creatures. And a mood-governed creature, no matter how gifted, no matter how brilliant, no matter how loudly the fire burned in its chest at the beginning, that creature will always, without exception, arrive at the end of its life having produced a fraction of what it was capable of producing. This is not cruelty. This is physics. Napoleon Hill, in his long and careful study of the men who had moved mountains, never once found a man of enduring achievement who operated primarily from feeling. What he found instead were men who had made a decision, a single, unshakable, almost violent decision, that they would move whether they felt like moving or not, that they would think whether clarity came easily or not, that they would work on the days of doubt with the same steady hand they used on the days of certainty. Hill called this the chief aim. But the chief aim is not merely a written goal, though so many have reduced it to that. The chief aim is a covenant with yourself. It is the moment when a man stops negotiating with his moods and starts governing them. It is the crossing of a line from which there is no comfortable return. Now, I want to paint something for you. I want you to see it clearly, because the image matters. Imagine a river. Not a rushing river, not a dramatic river with white water and spectacle. A slow river, a heavy river. The kind of river that moves through flat country at its own pace, indifferent to the seasons, indifferent to the weather, indifferent to the man standing on its banks, wishing it would hurry up or slow down or change direction. That river does not consult its mood before it moves. It moves because moving is its nature. It moves because it has committed, in the only language a river understands, to reaching the sea. And nothing, no drought, no obstacle, no long dry summer will alter that fundamental commitment. The river simply finds the lowest path, the most persistent path, and it keeps moving. Discipline is the river. Mood is the weather above it. The man who has surrendered the governance of his days to his moods has made a catastrophic trade. He has exchanged the power of his will, the most extraordinary instrument ever placed in a human being, for the fleeting comfort of following his feelings like a dog follows a scent. And the tragedy is not that he will fail dramatically. Dramatic failure, at least, has the mercy of being obvious. The tragedy is that he will fail slowly. He will fail quietly. He will fail in the accumulation of 10,000 small surrenders, each one feeling entirely reasonable at the time, each one feeling justified by circumstance or fatigue or the perfectly logical voice inside him that says, not today, perhaps tomorrow, conditions are not right, I am not at my best, I will begin again when I feel ready. Hill called this mental drifting. and he was not gentle about it. Mental drifting is the slow death of the will. It is what happens when a man refuses to take command of his own mental operations and instead allows the environment, the opinions of others, the discomforts of the moment, the weather of his emotions, to dictate the direction and quality of his thinking. The drifter is not a lazy man, necessarily. Many drifters work extremely hard, but they work hard on the wrong things, at the wrong times, for the wrong reasons, because they are responding to feeling rather than executing a plan. They are reactive rather than deliberate. And a reactive man, regardless of his energy, is building on sand. There is a companion to mental drifting that must be named here, because the two are brothers and they travel together almost always. That companion is the fear of criticism. Hill identified this fear as one of the 6 great fears that paralyze human potential. And of all 6, this one is perhaps the most insidious, because it disguises itself as wisdom. The man who is governed by the fear of criticism does not look afraid. He looks measured. He looks careful. He speaks about timing and strategy and waiting for the right moment, and all of it is, at its root, a profound terror of what other people will think and say if he moves before he is certain of success. And so he waits, and he waits. And in the waiting, the mood shifts, the fire cools, the vision blurs, and another year passes without a single brick being laid. I want to tell you about Andrew Carnegie, not the Carnegie of the statues and the libraries and the legend. I want to tell you about the Carnegie of 1867, the young man who had borrowed heavily to invest in the Keystone Bridge Company and several other ventures. The man who was watching those investments strain under the pressure of post-war economic turbulence. The man who was being advised by nearly everyone around him to pull back, to be cautious, to wait for a better moment. Carnegie was 32 years old. He had already tasted success, and he had already tasted the particular bitterness of seeing success threatened, and he would have been entirely justified by any reasonable standard in feeling uncertain, in feeling afraid, in consulting his mood and finding it dark and retreating accordingly. But Carnegie had made a decision years before that decision would be tested. He had decided in the private chambers of his own thinking that he was going to become the most powerful steel man in the world, not because it felt good, not because the circumstances were favorable, because he had decided. And a man who has truly decided does not revisit the decision every time his mood changes. He executes the decision regardless of mood, and he adjusts the method when necessary while keeping the destination fixed. Carnegie did not retreat in 1867. He borrowed more. He deepened his commitments. He moved forward through a feeling of dread with the same steady, almost mechanical consistency that would become his signature characteristic. And the people who watched him do it thought he was either reckless or insane, because they were judging his actions by the standard of their own mood-governed lives. They could not understand a man who did not consult his feelings before he moved. They could not comprehend a discipline that was not contingent on comfort. The bridge was built, the steel empire followed, and Carnegie, in later life, when he sat with Hill and spoke about the architecture of his success, did not point to brilliance. He did not point to luck or timing or the blessings of circumstance. He pointed again and again to the same plain and unsexy truth. He had decided, and then he had moved, and he had kept moving regardless of how the inside of his chest felt on any given morning. That is the covenant. That is what discipline over mood actually means when you strip away the abstraction and look at it in the flesh of a real human life under real pressure. Now I want to speak about Thomas Edison. Edison, at 45, had a laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and a reputation that had already made him one of the most celebrated men in America. He had the phonograph. He had demonstrated incandescent light to the world. He was, by any external measure, an extraordinary success. And then, in the winter of 1914, fire consumed his laboratory. Almost everything was destroyed. Years of work, materials, the physical infrastructure of his creative life gone in the course of a single night. Edison was 67 years old when this happened. Not 32, not 40, 67. An age when most men would look at the smoking ruins of their life's work and feel entirely entitled to stop. Edison's son Charles ran to his father in a panic. He found the old man standing at the edge of the fire, watching it burn, and the expression on Edison's face was not the expression Charles expected. It was not grief. It was not despair. It was something closer to fascination. Edison turned to his son and said, in words that have survived because they deserve to survive, that there was great value in disaster, because all of one's mistakes were burned away and one could start fresh. This is not the response of a man governed by mood. A man governed by mood, standing at the edge of 67 years and watching the physical evidence of his genius burn, would feel what any reasonable person would feel: devastation, exhaustion, the legitimate and understandable desire to rest. But Edison did not operate from feeling. He operated from a decision so deeply embedded in the architecture of his character that catastrophe could not reach it. He had decided who he was. He had decided what he was doing. And a fire, however enormous, did not have the authority to revise that decision. Within 3 weeks, Edison had begun reconstruction. Within a year, the laboratory was producing again. Not because the mood was right, because the man had mastered the relationship between his will and his feelings, and in that mastery, he had made himself effectively indestructible. Before I continue, answer one question honestly, and I mean honestly, in the private interior of your own thinking, where no performance is required and no audience is watching. When was the last time you did the necessary thing on a day when you did not feel like doing it? Not occasionally. Not when the stakes were highest and the adrenaline carried you through. On an ordinary day, a gray day, a day when the mood was flat and the work was hard and everything inside you said, not today. When was the last time you looked at that feeling, acknowledged it fully, and then moved anyway, not to punish yourself, not to prove something to someone else, but because you had decided, and decisions are not subject to renegotiation by feeling? If you're still listening, something inside you is waking up. The drifter is leaving. The master is arriving. Because that question is the whole lesson. Everything I have said and everything I am about to say radiates outward from that single, uncomfortable question. The moment you can answer it with honesty and with consistency, the moment you can say, without performance or exaggeration, that you moved on the gray day, that you worked when the feeling was absent, that you kept the covenant with yourself, even when no one was watching and nothing felt good. That is the moment you have crossed from mood-governed to self-governed. And self-governed men build things. They build things that outlast them. They build things that change the shape of the world. Let me speak now about Henry Ford. Ford in 1921 faced a crisis that would have ended most men. The economy had contracted sharply after the First World War. Ford Motor Company was carrying staggering debt, approximately $58 million, a figure almost incomprehensible in that era. His bankers, his advisors, and nearly everyone in his immediate circle were preparing themselves for what they believed was the inevitable collapse of the company. Ford was told with the quiet authority of financial experts that he would need to take on investors, surrender control, restructure his ownership. He was told this was the only rational path. Henry Ford listened to all of this advice with his characteristic stillness. And then he did something that defied every reasonable reading of the situation. He closed his plants for a brief period. He stripped his operation down to its bones. He found efficiencies that no one had thought to look for. He shipped cars to his dealerships and quietly required them to pay in advance or find other arrangements. And through a series of moves that looked, from the outside, like the behavior of a man who had not fully understood the severity of his situation, Ford paid off the debt entirely, without surrendering a single percentage of control. His advisors were astounded. His bankers were quietly embarrassed. And when people asked Ford how he had remained calm enough to think clearly through a crisis of that magnitude, he said something that Hill would later regard as one of the purest expressions of the mastermind principle he had ever encountered. Ford said that he had refused to allow the feeling of panic to occupy the same space as the thought of solution. That one could feel the weight of a problem or one could think through a problem, but one could not do both simultaneously with any real effectiveness. And so he had made a deliberate, conscious choice to occupy his mind with solution and to leave no room for the emotion of crisis to take residence there. This is extraordinary. This is not the suppression of emotion. This is the governance of mental real estate. Ford was not pretending the crisis did not exist. He was not performing false confidence. He was exercising the most sophisticated form of self-discipline available to a human mind, the discipline of directing attention, the discipline of choosing, in the face of genuine threat, where the mind would live and what it would do. This is what Hill meant by the mastermind principle in its deepest application. Not merely the alliance of like-minded individuals, though that is part of it, but the mastery of one's own mental operations, the ability to look at the chaos of circumstance and say, with authority and without apology, I will think here, and I will not be moved by the weather of feeling from the work of thinking. Now I want to speak to you about the architecture of a disciplined day, because philosophy without application is entertainment, and I am not here to entertain you. A disciplined day does not begin when you feel ready. A disciplined day begins when it begins, because you decided the night before that it would begin at that hour, and your decision governs, not your mood. Hill was emphatic on this point, though he expressed it in the language of definiteness of purpose. A man with a definiteness of purpose does not wake up and consult his feelings about whether today is a good day to pursue his aim. He pursues his aim every day with the same steady, unremarkable, relentless consistency that the river shows in moving toward the sea. The great secret that no one in the middle of their struggle wants to hear is that inspiration is a consequence of discipline, not a prerequisite for it. The men and women who wait for inspiration before they begin will wait their entire lives, growing increasingly bitter and increasingly certain that they are the victims of some cosmic unfairness that denied them the gift that was freely given to others. But the truth is merciless on this point. Inspiration follows action. The muse, if you insist on that language, does not arrive before you sit down. She arrives after you have been sitting down for 40 minutes, working badly, working through the resistance, working through the flatness of feeling, and then suddenly the work opens up and the feeling arrives. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, that the feeling was never the engine, it was always the passenger. Discipline is the engine, and discipline, properly understood, is not punishment. This is a confusion that costs people enormously. They associate discipline with severity, with self-denial, with the grim face of sacrifice, and because that association is unpleasant, They resist discipline the way they resist anything unpleasant. But the men Hill studied did not experience discipline as punishment. They experienced it as freedom. Carnegie experienced the freedom of a man who did not have to negotiate with himself every morning about whether he felt like building an empire today. Ford experienced the freedom of a man who did not have to ask his emotions for permission to think. Edison experienced the freedom of a man whose identity was so clear and so deep that even fire could not confuse him about who he was and what he was doing. When a man has truly established discipline over mood, his days become extraordinarily simple. Not easy, simple. The complexity of the undisciplined life, all the internal negotiation, all the justification, all the elaborate reasoning about why today is not the right day, that complexity vanishes. In its place comes a clean, uncluttered certainty about what needs to happen next. And that certainty, sustained over months and years, is the invisible machinery behind every fortune, every masterwork, every movement that has ever changed the direction of human history. The persistence principle, which Hill placed at the center of his entire framework, is simply discipline extended through time. It is the refusal to let time erode the decision. Because mood changes by the hour, but time erodes by the decade. And the man who could not govern his mood in the first year of his pursuit will, by the 10th year, have talked himself into a comprehensive and beautifully reasoned philosophy of why his original aim was unrealistic. He will have constructed from the raw materials of 10 years of small surrenders an entire worldview designed to justify the surrender, and he will believe it completely, because the mind is extraordinarily good at retroactively explaining what the will failed to execute. The antidote to this is not willpower in the popular sense, that white-knuckled, teeth-clenching exertion of force against desire. The antidote is habit. The antidote is the conversion of discipline into automatic behavior through consistent repetition until the disciplined action requires no more willpower than breathing. Carnegie did not fight himself every morning to go to work. Edison did not wage an internal war to enter the laboratory. The discipline had become the default. The mood, whatever it was, had been rendered irrelevant, not by defeating it, but by outranking it. This is the destination. This is what the philosophy points toward. You think it, you feel it, you act on it, you become it. Not in that order, not with that luxury. You act on it first, before you are certain, before you are ready, before the feeling arrives to confirm you. You act because you decided, and the decision governs, and then you feel it later, when the work is done and the evidence is accumulating and the river has moved another mile toward the sea. And then, having acted and having felt the confirmation of action, you think more clearly, you see further, you plan with more precision, and in the fullness of time, across the long and ordinary accumulation of disciplined days, you become the thing you decided to become. Not by inspiration, not by luck, not by the accident of feeling the right thing at the right moment, by decision, by the covenant kept, by the 10,000 mornings when the mood was flat and the work was hard and you moved anyway because moving was your nature now, because the river had forgotten how to stop. There's a final image I want to leave you with. Somewhere in your life, right now, today, there is a thing you know needs doing. You know it with a certainty that has nothing to do with feeling and everything to do with truth. You have known it for weeks, possibly months. You have visited it in the quiet moments before sleep, and you have felt the particular discomfort of a man who is not doing what he knows he should be doing. That discomfort is not your enemy. That discomfort is your compass. It is pointing with the unwavering accuracy of a thing that has no personal interest in your comfort directly at the place where your discipline has not yet matched your knowledge. The question is not whether you are capable. You are capable. The question is never about capability. The question is whether you will govern yourself or be governed, whether the decision will lead or the mood will lead, whether you will be the river or the weather. The men whose names we still speak, Carnegie, Edison, Ford, they were not gods. They were not immune to fear or doubt or the cold flatness of a gray morning when the aim felt distant and the effort felt enormous. They were men, ordinary men in their private moments, extraordinary men in their public results. And the distance between those two things, between the ordinary private moment of doubt and the extraordinary public result, was crossed every single time by discipline over mood. That is the whole lesson. It was never more complicated than that, and it will ask more of you than you think you have, right up until the moment you discover that you had it all along. If something in these words moved something in you, if you found yourself answering that question honestly, even for a moment, then pass this along to someone who needs to hear it. Not to spread a message, but because you already know the person this was written for. You thought of them somewhere in the middle of it. That thought was not an accident. And if these ideas are worth returning to, then stay close. There is more to say, and it will be said without ornament and without apology, the way the river moves quietly, persistently, and always toward the sea.